Hey everyone, Teresa Gregorio here for the Knit Petite project, and I want to try and keep it a little dense this week and give you a little shot of information about this week's post, which goes into the history of sizing standards and essentially how we arrived at what we have today. So what we have today ends up sort of being a bit of a conglomeration of a bunch of things which are not as old as you might think, which I find encouraging and makes me feel a little bit more empowered to take it apart and use it to my own ends. But in order to do that, I think it's important for us to understand a little bit about how it is the way it is and why it is the way it is. So the history of it is actually not as far back as we may think that it is. Sort of amazingly, at least I thought it was amazing. The first very widespread collection of anthropometric data from women happened in the late 1930s in the United States. That's not that long ago. And at least for me, being in Canada, that's not that far away geographically. So it's not something from a very, very long time ago or very, very far away. It's data that feels a lot more accessible in a number of ways. So they did this study in the late 1930s, and I think 1941 they came out with their recommendations, and they ended up taking over data from over 10,000 women, but that data was flawed. And that data was flawed because they took women only of a particular age range. It was, I think, 18 to 30-year-olds. It was from the 1930s, so body shapes change, right? Over time, we're going to be different size now overall than we were back then. But also, and importantly, they only took data from white women. People were volunteering from all different backgrounds, but they actually were instructed to use the data only from the white women, which makes an impact on what you're collecting and then what you recommend and disseminate from that. This information collected in the 40s went on to, through a number of different companies, be encouraged to create a national standard of sizing. So that was created in the late 50s, and the Mail Order Association of America used it to essentially increase their ability to deliver goods that were going to fit people the right way. Unfortunately, it didn't, because they were using that data, and that data at that point even was not reflective of the bodies of the people that they were trying to serve. So from there, in the 1970s, I think it was 1970 or 71, a revision to that old data happened. So not very much changed. Apparently they did not do another widespread collection of anthropometric data in the 70s or in the 60s, I suppose. They just sort of shifted the numbers around a little bit. And so from there, to be honest, not much has really changed in a very widespread way. There have been exciting new technologies like 3D body scanners, and they're trying to compile collections of information. Certain companies are making use of that information. It's behind a giant paywall, as you can imagine. These studies and this collection of data with these 3D scanners is supported through a number of different companies, and so they're not going to just necessarily going to be interested in giving me access to that information, right? You can see the effects of some of that data collection in some different retailers' stores. So for example, you may prefer to shop at store X rather than store Y, because store X, their clothes just seem to fit you better. That may be because store X is using data that they've collected themselves. They're trying very much to fit a particular target market. So you can think about sizing systems and the way that retailers and manufacturers use them as a marketing tool. Famously, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the company, so I'll just describe what happened instead. Certain companies are aimed specifically at certain target markets to the exclusion of others, and they're vocal about it. So in some cases, you'll go into stores and you'll try something on and realize that this store is not for you, because they really have made it not be for you. You are not the body that they're aiming for. So that's a negative way of looking at it. A positive way of looking at it is if you do indeed find a store that caters to your size. For whatever reason, maybe they have a fit model they're using, maybe the charts they're using or they're comparing themselves to are closer to your actual body measurements. So the positive side of retailers having that kind of power to create the data and then the clothing from it means that you might be able to find a store that really does fit you very well. The strength of that is, remember, we were talking about the original data from the 30s and 40s. They were only talking about a very narrow segment of humans, a very narrow segment of American women, to be honest. Retailers can then define a target market entirely separate from that, and you may be that target market. And so they may be serving you very specifically, because if you can imagine all of the different points of measurement that you would have to somehow be able to navigate through to create a sizing system that is going to serve all, we'll say, American women. Very nearly impossible task. There's a paper that I read talking about Canadian standardized sizing that said something like, in order to even approach that, you'd need, in order to, according to their calculations, something 72 different sizes, which is mind-blowing. But really imagine that. You have things that you cross like age and ethnicity and body shape and weight and height. As according to the Knit Petite project, is something that is, it's important, and we see that sometimes in the way that clothing does or does not serve our needs and our particular body shape. All of that is to say, there's a lot more information there, and there are certain things like the standard PS 4270. This is the one that came out, that the American government came out with in the 1970s. You can actually find that online, and it's for free. I found the PDF myself, and I've linked it in the post for this week, so you can find that and you can look at that information. So they based that on the old 1940s information, but also some information they gathered from the military, the American military, which again, as you can imagine, is going to skew the data to perhaps a more athletic body type if you're taking data from people in the military, possibly. So look all that up yourself. Look at sizing charts for different retailers that may give you more thorough information when you're looking for clothing to buy for yourself. But insofar as knitwear design, many publications, not all of them, but many of them, recommend that designers look at the CYC standards, which are connected, of course, to that old data as well. You have to derive your information from somewhere, so you have to have standards based on something. And in many cases, those standards are based on an assumption of the relation between your bust, waist, and hips, and the vertical measurements then connected to those as well. And if you don't parse out extra tall or extra short people, then your data is going to serve a narrower segment of people and be skewed because of that. So the paper that I showed you guys last week said that there has actually not been any kind of in-depth study done with this new 3D body scan technology and data that has been created from that technology. So unless and until we have that, and academics parse through it, make recommendations, and then retailers embrace that, we're going to have to work with the sizing standards that we have currently. I don't mean for that to sound like a negative thing. I think as long as we know what that is, we can then see how we deviate from it, and it is then more likely that we can know how we deviate and then what to do to bring those deviations closer to the fit that we want to achieve. That's a lot of densely packed information, but important to know sort of moving forward, because later on in the month we're going to start actually comparing different sizing charts to each other and take some of those measurements that I talked about last week and apply that to those charts. And now I hope that you know that a lot of these sizing charts and these standards aren't really that old. They're not even 100 years old. I hope you feel even more comfortable messing around with that information, deconstructing it and making it fit yourself. So the question for this week is, I'm wondering actually if perhaps you do have a store that you are more keen to shop in than another store because of fit specifically. If that's the case, please share that information with me. Do all of your own research. There's a bunch of different countries that have already been using this different body scanning technology to gain information. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. They're listed in the blog post. But look into that. See see what kind of information you can access about your country's sizing collection data. Thanks for tuning in to the Knit Petite project, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next week.